Hello, and welcome to Western Civ, episode 309, English Intrigues. Back in England, the religious convulsions were less epic than in France, but not by much. Certainly not if you ask the Queen. In February 1571, Elizabeth heaped further honors on William Cecil, making him first Baron Burghley. Her inner circle had now shrunk effectively to 3 men, Cecil, Dudley, and Walsingham. Though this inner circle often agreed on state policy, that was not universally true. In 1571, England stood precariously isolated. It was now under interdict. Spain and France both wanted a defensive alliance, but only to serve their own purposes. Everyone saw England as a second-class kingdom. An English alliance, though, would, of necessity, mean a marriage as well. Elizabeth, therefore, had to be amenable to both. That February, she sent word to France that she was, finally, willing to discuss such a proposal. But as always, religion would prove the sticking point. If she were to marry Henri, the Duke of Anjou, Elizabeth was insistent that he convert to the Anglican faith. Anjou would not. Almost immediately, both sides reached an impasse, though this was hardly the end of that story. That same February, a Scottish delegation arrived in London to speak with the English Queen. They made it clear that it was the desire of everyone within James IV's court that Elizabeth needed to stay out of the succession issues in Scotland. They did not, under any, and I do mean any, circumstances, want England attempting to restore Mary Stuart to her throne. No one wanted her back. And to be fair to Elizabeth, she had no intention of putting Mary back on the throne, as she did not want a Catholic neighbor to the north. It did not take long for news of all of this to reach Mary, who threw herself whole hog now into trying to secure her release through intrigue. In reality, Mary had already become involved in one of the most serious plots of Elizabeth's reign. Since the collapse of the Northern Rising, nothing had been heard of one of the most important agents of said rising, Roberto Ridolfi, a Florentine banker who doubled as a papal agent. Then, in January 1571, Ridolfi had written to Mary, offering to act as her representative to the courts of Europe. There, he could be well placed to stir up support for her. He had conceived of a plan whereby the Catholic powers would invade England, overthrow Elizabeth, and set Mary in Norfolk up in her place. Already, King Philip and the Pope had agreed in principle to support the plan. Now, he needed the consent of Mary herself. Mary, after obtaining the Pope's approval, was only too happy to give it. This is what she had been praying for. She told Ridolfi to inform her friends that if they did invade England, they could expect the support of many influential lords, and provide him with credentials issued by herself to show King Philip, the Pope, and the Duke of Alba. Now, the other side of this story is, of course, the Duke of Norfolk. Now, even though Norfolk was presently in the Tower of London, Mary still cherished hopes that he would be her savior. She wrote to him, rather foolishly, expressing her earnest desire that they marry. This was an absurd request that Elizabeth would never in a million years grant, and of course, given Norfolk's present situation, they both needed a lot of royal grace to make the marriage happen. Moreover, when Norfolk was finally released from the Tower, he swore to the Queen that he would never again even entertain the thought of helping Mary Stuart. But the fact that Mary was now pressing the point makes it clear just how desperate she had become. On February 8th, 1571, Mary wrote to Norfolk, outlining Ridolfi's plans and inviting him to join the conspiracy. The Duke had no desire to become involved, at a great danger to himself in what was undoubtedly high treason. He was also alarmed at Mary's insistence that he become a Catholic. But by the 10th of March, Mary had worn down his resistance, and, most likely driven by the hope of obtaining a crown, he met Ridolfi in secret and offered his help and support. When he refused to sign a written request for men and supplies to King Philip, Ridolfi simply forged his name on the document. 2 weeks later, Ridolfi left for Rome, where the Pope was pleased to bless his enterprise. Now, news reached English spies in April that the Queen of Scots was in fact secretly corresponding with the Duke of Alva. Shrewsbury, Mary's jailer, was instructed to keep a close eye on his prisoner. Things got even more serious when the Duke of Tuscany, who had recently hosted Ridolfi, wrote to the English court warning everyone of the pending conspiracy. Secretly, Cecil was excited, waiting and hoping that Mary would further incriminate herself, which would finally give him the evidence he wanted to proceed against her and secure her execution. When Parliament reassembled in May of 1571, its priority was to preempt any Catholic plots and tighten national security, and 3 acts were passed to this end. From now on, it would be high treason to say that Elizabeth was not the lawful Queen of England, or to publish, write, or say that she was a heretic, infidel, tyrant, or usurper. It would also be treason for anyone to bring a papal bull even into the realm. Crucifixes, rosaries, and religious pictures were banned. Finally, Catholics who had fled abroad were ordered to return within 6 months. If they did not, their possessions were forfeit. Now, life was becoming very difficult for those Catholics still living in England. They had to make sure to attend Anglican services and watch their tongue when talking about the Queen. However, contrary to what you might expect, most were not interested in supporting Mary's conspiracy. In fact, most were ardently loyal to Elizabeth. By the end of June, Ridolfi was warmly received by Philip II in Madrid. By now, the details of the plot had been finalized. The Duke of Alva would invade England with 6,000 Spanish troops from the Netherlands, and would then march on London and occupy it. Simultaneously, Norfolk would incite loyal English Catholics to rise up against Elizabeth, who would be seized by the Duke and either assassinated or held in hostage for Mary's safety. Mary would be liberated and proclaimed Queen of England. Then she and Norfolk would marry, and in time reign as joint sovereigns over England and Scotland, to which kingdoms they would of course restore the Catholic faith. There were fatal weaknesses in the plan. The biggest weakness being that Ridolfi, like most Catholics, vastly overestimated the number of English Catholics who would be willing to rise on Mary's behalf. He believed the number was around 39,000. It was, let's just say, a lot less. The Florentine banker had no real understanding of English politics or the English people, and Norfolk, who should have understood both, was either too gullible or too blinded by ambition to point out the flaws. It was left to the Duke of Alva, ultimately, and really interestingly, to veto the plan. Alva, who had dismissed Ridolfi as, quote, that great chatterbox, end quote, was convinced that the invasion would fail, and that if it did, it would do irreparable harm to Catholicism in general as well as Mary's cause, and might well cost her her life. He was almost certainly right about that. He refused point blank to use his troops in the enterprise, knowing that without them, Philip was powerless to help the Queen of Scots. Throughout the summer, the other conspirators tried to persuade Alva to change his mind, but with no success. Meanwhile, Elizabeth's court was undergoing some important changes. In July of 1571, the Earl of Leicester, Robert Dudley, was finally cleared of any previous allegations of treason which improved his standing. He remained closer to the Queen than anyone else, but a new player had now emerged, Christopher Hatton. He was 31 years old and strikingly handsome, and, in the words of many, the perfect courtier. Hatton constantly flattered the Queen, and unlike her other courtiers, he remained unmarried. Dudley was desperately jealous of him. It was this court, in March, that learned of Elizabeth's intentions to marry the Duke of Anjou, or at least that was what she told her council. Soon afterwards, Catherine de' Medici sent a special envoy, Guido Cavalcanti, to England with a formal proposal of marriage from Anjou, a flattering portrait of him, and a list of demands. The Duke must be permitted to practice the Catholic faith. He was to be crowned King of England on the day after the wedding, and the England exchequer was to pay him an annual income of £60,000 for life. Elizabeth made difficulties about all these conditions. She would not agree to the Duke being crowned, nor to granting him a life income. They couldn't have paid that anyway. And while she conceded that she would not be compelled to attend Anglican services, she would refuse Anjou's request to attend Mass at all, even in private. Throughout the spring, more and more obstacles to this match continued to appear. The Duke made several rude remarks about Elizabeth's age, which were in turn reported back to her. Elizabeth had grown increasingly sensitive about her years, and did acknowledge the age gap between them. It was over a decade, and that it was concerning. Many diplomats throughout Europe assumed Elizabeth was up to her old tricks, merely playing the French for time. Indeed, by September it was clear to everyone involved that there would be no marriage. That being said, the negotiations had brought England and France closer together, and there were many in both courts that hoped there would be an alliance nonetheless. In August 1571, Elizabeth, against all advice, decided to go on a progress. This is one of those late summer tours of the kingdom. Now, luckily for her, by then, it was pretty clear that Ridolfi's plot was without merit. On August the 26th, a courtier finally turned in the Duke of Norfolk for sending suspicious letters to Mary. The Duke was arrested on September 3rd and taken to the Tower, where he later revealed all he knew. This then led to Mary's main confidant, the Bishop of Ross, to be arrested. Threatened with torture, which is unusual for a man of the cloth, he revealed all he knew. It was enough to see both Mary and Norfolk executed for high treason. Elizabeth immediately expelled the Spanish ambassador, who was clearly implicated in the plot. Our old friend Ridolfi, however, he got off scot-free, having already fled the kingdom. After the Ridolfi plot, Elizabeth changed her attitude toward Mary, who was now kept more securely under lock and key. Bitterly disillusioned, she decided that she would finally recognize James VI as the King of Scotland. This effectively ended forever any notion that Mary would be free. When Mary was confronted with all this evidence, all she would say was that she had been trying to recover her throne in Scotland, and that all this had nothing to do with any English intrigues. She claimed she had never known Ridolfi at all, and would say nothing at all about Norfolk, when in reality, all of her confiscated letters suggested the opposite. Even Charles IX in France, really Mary's last hope, decided to abandon her as a lost cause at this point. This is really kind of endgame for Mary. She had no more moves to make in the great game of early modern intrigue. Had she been smarter, she would have just given up and spent the rest of her life in quiet captivity. But, as we will see, she wasn't. In fact, in the weeks after the conspiracy, she had the gall to write Elizabeth, seeking to excuse her behavior. The English Queen did not respond. The Ridolfi plot also convinced Elizabeth and her government that England needed an ally, and that ally was France. The Queen did her best to revive marriage negotiations with Anjou as a consequence. Walsingham advised against the idea. He knew Anjou would never agree no matter how many concessions Elizabeth granted. He was very invested in the present time in the notion of becoming the King of Poland, which would require him to marry a Polish princess. Besides, Anjou had never been keen on the match in the first place. Elizabeth sent ambassadors regardless, who soon discovered that no matter how much Catherine pleaded with her son, he would not marry Elizabeth. Catherine, however, recognizing how much France needed an ally as well, decided to offer her younger son, Hercules Francois, Alcyon, instead. But Hercules Francois was only 17 years old and badly scarred from several bouts of smallpox. Elizabeth rejected the notion immediately, but Walsingham encouraged her to at least draw out the negotiations for England's benefit, which she agreed to do. Domestically, matters remained tense, as 1571 gave way to 1572. That January, the Duke of Norfolk was tried before a jury of 26 in Westminster on charges of treason. He was found guilty on all 13 counts of foregone conclusion in Tudor England. Norfolk was sentenced to be drawn and quartered, though everyone knew when the condemned was a peer, the sentence would be commuted to decapitation. When Mary Stuart heard the news, she wept pitifully. The Duke's execution was set for the 21st of January, but Elizabeth could not bring herself to sign his death warrant. Not only was he the foremost peer in England and popular with the people, but he was also her cousin. So she put off the moment while the days turned into weeks. Later on, William Cecil would write, quote, "The King's Majesty hath always been a merciful lady, and by mercy she hath taken more harm than justice, and yet she thinks she is more beloved in doing herself harm. God save her to his honor long among us." End quote. Early in February, Elizabeth was prevailed upon to sign the death warrant. But on the night before the Duke's execution was due to take place, she sent for Cecil, and in great distress, rescinded the order again. The spectators who turned up at Tower Hill the next morning had to watch the hangings of two common criminals instead. In March 1572, Elizabeth fell seriously ill, and many began to wonder if the Duke would ever face justice. For a moment, it honestly seemed as though she might die, and both Cecil and Dudley, as they always did when it seemed like Elizabeth might pass, put aside their differences and prepared for a contested succession. But she recovered. Still, as always happened when Elizabeth had a brush with death, those around her became convinced there needed to be some solution to the succession issue. Her counselors convinced Elizabeth to call Parliament and, at the very least, take some action against Mary Stuart to make it clear to the Catholic powers of Europe that that door was forever and firmly shut. That April, Elizabeth again signed Norfolk's death warrant, and then, later, again, withdrew the same. Public feeling against Mary Stuart was running high. Most of Elizabeth's subjects agreed with men like Walsingham, believing that, quote, "so long as this devilish woman lives, neither her Majesty must make account to continue in quiet possession of the crown, nor her faithful servants assure themselves of the safety of their lives." End quote. And so, when Parliament met in May of 1572, they read out a whole list of Mary's misdeeds to both houses, who immediately then demanded she be put to death. One member of Parliament declared he feared to go to sleep after hearing how the Queen of Scots had murdered Lord Darnley and plunged Scotland into chaos, and insisted the Queen, quote, "cut off her head and make more ado about her," end quote. Another member pointed out, quote, "warning hath already been given, and therefore the axe must be the next warning," end quote. The Lords and Commons arranged for a committee to be set up to determine Mary's fate. By the 19th of May, its members had come up with two alternative ways of proceeding. Either Mary could be attainted of treason and executed immediately, or they could legislate to bar her from the succession and warn her that if she plotted against Elizabeth again, she would be put to death. Parliament was unanimously in favor of the first course, the immediate execution. But the Queen insisted that it would be wiser to adopt the second, since honor would not permit her to attaint a foreign sovereign who was not subject to English law. It would also be very costly and mean that Parliament would have to sit through the summer, when there was usually an outbreak of plague in London. The Lords and Commons were past caring about all that. They wanted Mary's head. Frankly, several wrote to her that they didn't believe, given her past conduct, that any threatening legislation would deter Mary from plotting against the Queen in the future, nor preventing traitorous subjects from aiding her. Parliament then submitted to the Queen a petition for Mary's head. Elizabeth again refused to sign. Instead, she gave a speech to Parliament explaining why she was declining to attaint Mary, and evidently that convinced everyone except one member of Parliament who held out. So, on the 26th of May, having been forced to take less drastic measures against Mary, Parliament drew up a list of her offenses, depriving her of her pretended claim to the throne. From henceforth, it would be an offense for anyone to proclaim or assert it. However, when the bill was submitted to the Queen for royal assent, she exercised her veto. It was now obvious that she meant to take no action whatsoever against her cousin. And frankly, her Privy Council despaired. Their intelligence from abroad showed conclusively that both King Philip and the Pope were set upon overthrowing Elizabeth in Mary's favor. It was probably around this time that Elizabeth wrote her famous sonnet about Mary, which was published in her lifetime in the book The Art of Poetry. Here's a little extract of it, quote, "The daughter of debate that ex sorrow doth sow shall reap no gain where former rule hath taught still peace to grow. Nor foreign banished wit shall anchor in this port. Our realm it brooks no stranger's force. Let them elsewhere report. Our rusty sword with rest shall first his edge employ to pull their tops that seek such change and gape for joy." End quote. Having spared Mary, Elizabeth had no choice. She had to throw Norfolk to the wolves. Parliament had been agitating for the law to take its course, and so finally, on the 31st of May, the Queen finally gave in and signed the Duke's death warrant. On the following day, she paid a very rare visit to the Tower of London to ensure the arrangements had been made in a seemly and proper fashion, although she did not see Norfolk in person. At 7 a.m. on the 2nd of June, the Duke of Norfolk was beheaded on Tower Hill, declaring to the watching crowds that he had never been a papist and acknowledged the justness of the sentence of beheading. He told the assembled crowd, quote, "For men to suffer death in this place is no new thing. Since the beginning of our most gracious Queen's reign, I am the first, and God grant I may be the last." End quote. Standing there, dignified in a black satin doublet, he refused a blindfold and died bravely, his head being, quote, "at one chop off." End quote. His body was buried at the altar of St. Peter within the tower, between those of his two cousins, Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard. And so Mary Stuart escaped the chopping block yet again. For now. Before our next episode, if you'd like more Western Civ, feel free to check out the link in the show notes to Western Civ 2.0. Get you a 7-day free trial of a whole reboot. We're deep back into Roman history at this point, and everybody loves that. If you'd like to support the show in other ways, it is always helpful to get a review on Spotify, since that's where the vast majority of people listen. So if you have the time to do that, I would very much appreciate it.